So, part 3 of my epic journey in the martial arts. Lockdown here. And I suppose I've got to really talk about the combat years. I started off as feature writer, video reporter for combat, then feature writer, then editor. But it all started while I was running my own video library in a little town in Calne in Wiltshire. And during that time, we went to Florida for a family holiday. Disney did the whole thing. And me, being a big film fan, realised that Steven Seagal's Nico, Above the Law, was on, and it was getting rave reviews in the States. So I badgered my then wife to go see it with me while the grandparents looked after the children. And when we got back to England, I realised that in those days it was going to be months, almost 6 months really, before it came to England. So I wrote a review, sent it to Combat Magazine, which at the time was very big. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, 70s onwards, I suppose, combat was huge. And I was working behind the counter of my shop when I got a phone call from the then editor, who will remain nameless. I don't want to give him the time of day. And he said, "Did you write this?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, it's great. Could you do this regularly?" I said, "Of course." And then he said, "I'll send you what was back in the day, 2 VHSs. And I'd like you to review them and get them back to me as soon as possible." And that was Jean-Claude Van Damme's AWOL, Absent Without Leave, I think retitled Lionheart, and Dolph Lundgren's The Punisher, which I still think is a very underrated film for the time. I reviewed them both, and that was my first ever piece in combat. It was a double-page spread, 1-page AWOL, the second page The Punisher, and from there I became the regular video writer and had an absolutely enormous collection of American and Hong Kong-based martial arts films. I think at one stage I had over 2,000. They all went in the end, long story. But that's how I started in Combat Magazine. I was still running my grocery store. Combat, like all the martial arts magazines back then, didn't really want to pay contributors. They felt that the exposure was enough. Well, if I wanted exposure, I'd have become a flasher. Actually, less of that. Forget I said that. I never did. Never. Well, I was never caught. Well, no, anyway. So eventually, after a few regular columns and getting my own column as the video reviewer, I insisted that if I was going to work for them, I was going to be paid by them. And then that's when I became the actual feature writer and having to travel to Birmingham, which was a 2-hour round trip there and back, so 4 hours in total of my day just to get to work. And it wasn't long before they realised that I actually took a pretty good photo, so I became feature writer and photographer to save money again. Tight-fisted, I tell you. And so for a 10-year period, I worked my way from feature writer to eventual editor of all the magazines. But it meant that I travelled up and down the country interviewing a who's who of martial arts. And literally, if you look at the 10-year period, 12 magazines a year, anybody who was anybody in all the disciplines, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Brazilian, at one stage or another, I got to interview them, put a lot of them on the cover. A lot of the cover photos from combat were my photos as well. And it meant I got to see a huge array of martial arts talents and masters and grandmasters in this country. And of course, when they brought over their Japanese sensei or their Korean masters or their Brazil, I got to interview them as well, which was incredible. So when I look back, it really is, I can't list them all, it's just so many, either great British talent or their instructors from abroad. And it was, I've still got the tapes, I've still got them somewhere, a huge box of recorded tapes of all my interviews, which maybe when I'm gone, somebody will think of as a legacy, I don't know. But it's not about me, it's about those interviews for a certain period between 1990 and year 2000 were the who's who of the greats in this country's martial arts. But it also meant that as a film fan, and especially someone running a video library, I got to interview some of the biggest names in the martial arts filmic world, and I've had to write them down because there's so many. Chuck Norris, interviewed him twice, lovely man. They say never meet your heroes. He was wonderful. People don't realise how big he is as well. Huge shoulders you could ski down, about 6'1", which just showed you the size of the guys playing the villains in his movies. They were enormous, WWE wrestling size. Cynthia Rothrock, I mean, possibly the biggest female martial arts film star of all time. Steven Seagal, I mean, his early films, his first 4 or 5 films for me were some of the best ever. He went off the rails. The only way you can say it is got too big for his boots, and the studio shut him down to straight to video. The second time I interviewed him was when he was playing a career as a musician. He's a fantastic blues guitarist. And when he was playing his music and invited me along to a gig, and I spent the whole afternoon, had tea with him, which was sushi. I wish it was McDonald's, but it was sushi. It was good stuff. And he was wonderful, totally different man, and a brilliant guitarist. Don the Dragon Wilson, one of the greatest kickboxers of all time, started off by just ripping off Van Damme's Kickboxer, but he went on to have a huge straight-to-video career, very popular in my library and libraries across the country, and another wonderful man to meet in person, and a legendary kickboxer, Jeff Speakman, Kempo. My favourite interview, I interviewed him twice. We became friends, and an incredible guy, incredible character, never really had the career he deserved, but The Perfect Weapon is one of those great straight-to-DVD movies that you've got to watch. Olivier Gruner, French, very intelligent guy. Again, very good interview. Angel Town, a brilliant debut, just like the Perfect Weapon. And again, like Speakman, another one that never quite took off, but was always good on straight-to-video. Michel Kisi, Tong Po, I Want Tong Po. Belgian, incredible. When I met him, to see this head of hair and no Chinese or Thai, whatever you want to call it, eyes, just this normal Belgian guy, big but normal. And I remember at the time being told, when you interview Michel, please do not mention Jean-Claude Van Damme. They've fallen out. Jean-Claude's not treated him right. He's not happy with Jean-Claude. And if you mention Jean-Claude Van Damme, the interview's over. So me, being a good boy, went in there, said to Michel how much I admired his work and what a great guy he was, and he looked up and he goes, "Yes, thank you, Malcolm, and I'll tell you what, that Jean-Claude Van Damme," and we spent about 20 minutes discussing the very man I was told not to even mention. Possibly my favourite interview of all time, Jim Kelly from Enter the Dragon. You know, the man that was too busy looking good. It ended up such a long interview because we hit it off, that it went across 3 consecutive issues of Combat, virtually unheard of, and page after page. Incredible life he lived, and I got to really understand the racism in America at the time and how he had to fight for everything he got. The photo shoot was incredible. Jim was a quirky character and absolutely shredded. I mean, paper-thin skin and an incredible ab set. And I remember we were doing a set of photos that showed how you'd take someone out. And you would do a series of 6 and we would do it. So we said to Jim, could you do one for us? He was training with the Gracies at the time as well in jiu-jitsu, so we thought we'd get some great stuff. So we had someone attack him and he did a side kick. And we said, that's great, Jim, but we want about 3 or 5. What would you do after a side kick? He said, there ain't nothing after a Jim Kelly side kick. When he's hit with a Jim Kelly side kick, that's it, game over. That was a very poor impression of Jim Kelly, but you get the impression. So we said, well, Jim, we know that if you hit them with this sidekick, it'd be all over. But for sake of argument, if it wasn't, what would you do next? Right, if he got up, then Jim gave us what we wanted. And I have such fond memories of that because Enter the Dragon was the film that was everything to me, that got me started in the martial arts. And to meet Jim and spend such a full day with him and do what was to become an iconic combat interview is one of the big highlights. Gary Daniels, great British talent, recently was seen in The Expendables with a great fight with Statham Jet Li. Unsung hero, should have been a superstar. I think being British held him back, but he was in a lot of Don Wilson movies. He was a great fighter himself. He was a genuine, hard, full contact fighter. And I got to spend a lovely day with him in London. We went around Chinatown. He treated me to dinner. We looked at the shops, the memorabilia shops, and we had a lovely chat and interview. And that man, to this day, is in incredible shape, a wonderful gent. And a superb straight-to-video star that should have been far, far bigger. Michael Dudikoff, the American Ninja, admitted, not a martial artist. Now, he was an actual fitness freak. He was a champion in these Ironman championships where you go on a bike, you run, you cycle, you swim, you fight sharks, you climb mountains. But he was incredibly fit, and it was his physique and his male model looks that got him the part. But he was such a humble guy, and he never tried to say that he was this martial arts master. And he was shocked as anyone at the success of the American Ninja movies and his subsequent career, where he was offered a lot of movies that if, for example, Chuck Norris turned them down, they then offer Michael Dudikoff. So a lot of the movies you saw Dudikoff in were potential sequels to movies that Chuck Norris had made or would offer Chuck. And he was so grateful for his career, Dudikoff, and such a lovely guy. Now, for me, another personal favourite was, if you grew up watching the Bruce Lee movies, when Bruce Lee died, there was a raft of movies after that cashed in. And one of them that really got me was Enter the Black Dragon, and a guy called Ron Van Cleef. And Ron was a hero of mine because I thought it was great. I loved them. I was a young, impressionable teenager. And when Combat did the first ever sort of like big show at the NEC, the Combat Spectacular, I think it was 1991, everybody was looking at Peter Kwong, Cynthia Rothrock, Bill Wallace, who I interviewed all those guys on the same day, all of them. People were looking at them and going, wow, wow, wow. And there's this quiet black gentleman in the corner, just humble. And I went up to him and said, excuse me, sir, are you Ron Van Cleef? And he went, yes. I went, oh my God, can I interview you? And he was like, really? I said, yeah. And so even though I interviewed Cynthia Rothrock, Don Wilson, Peter Kwong, Bill Wallace, all on that day, my favourite interview that day was Ron Van Cleef. And those that know, as they say, know. And at that time, one of the things about that Combat show was, it for me probably gave us the first ever British super fight, Tim Isley and Cash Gill. And I did all the preamble to it. I interviewed both the guys. We built it up in Combat, put it on the cover, and it didn't disappoint. An incredible fight that Cash Gill finally won by stoppage. And if you ask Tim Isley, Tim will still tell you, very proud man, great fighter, that he could have continued. And I think that's the fight that really, Tim, if he looks back on, we all lose, but that hurt him the most. But it was incredible at the time, and I feel the first British super fight. And again, through Combat, I had a very young man send me a VHS and said, I want to get in Combat. I'd love to be on the cover. I'm going to be a future star. I'm going to be the new Van Damme. And you think, yeah, till you see the video and you realise, wow. And that's the reaction I had when I saw Scott Adkins' video. And yes, I did get him in Combat. Yes, he did get the cover. And boy, did he turn out to do exactly what he said he did. And if he was born 20 years earlier, he'd have been up there with Norris, Seagal, Van Damme, without a doubt. Watch his films. They're generic. They're action films. But the man is phenomenal in them. And again, that was through Combat. And some of you may know, some of you may not know, I made a film called Sucker Punch with my longtime friend Joe Long, who did so much work on that film. He was the man. He was the producer, and boy did he work on that film. But before that even started, a friend of mine, Ewan Briscoe, asked me to interview Danny John Jules, Cat from Red Dwarf, Death in Paradise now. And I interviewed him in my hometown. He travelled to Swindon, and I gave him a KFC. One of the most chilled out, nicest men you could ever meet. Nobody that meets Danny doesn't fall in love with him. He's incredible. And I offered him the script to Sucker Punch. I actually wrote it with him in mind, with the way he could do things. And he accepted, and once he accepted, and I told Joe Long basically got this film off the ground. And I've had a relationship with Danny John Jules ever since, and it's been incredible. He's a wonderful actor, an even better man. And then after years of feature writing, I was offered the editorship, and I edited Combat, Taekwondo and Korean martial arts, and traditional karate. And at my insistence, as MMA was coming through, finally the owners gave me the go-ahead to start Fighters magazine, where we looked totally at the full contact world, including the new MMA scene. And I'm very proud of starting that magazine and giving it a really great start. But after years of not being able to get along with he who shall not even be named, I finally couldn't take anymore. And after roughly 10 years with the magazine, I quit to just do the shows and other things. But those combat years, not only did I get to interview who's who of martial arts cinema, but all the greats of the British martial arts world, to photograph them, incredible memories. And although it ended acrimoniously, 10 wonderful years for me. And part 4, the final part of this trilogy, will be the other huge shows that I had the pleasure and the privilege to work on, and I've been so grateful for. So both of you, stay tuned. Like Arnie, I'll be back.